I suppose the key to Basil is the snobbery. And therefore we thought that in the first episode, someone who was pretending to be a lord and who wasn't would take advantage of Basil in a particularly endearing way. And Michael Gwynn, who did the part, was not only excellent, he was very funny. He told me about a hotel, really lodging house he used to stay with. And they had so many signs up, you know, switch the light off, you know, and do this and don't do that, and no things allowed here. He realized that if you followed all the signs, if you carried out all the commands issued by the signs, they wouldn't need any staff in the hotel at all. I was saying that, it was a wonderful insight. But that was a very experimental episode, and I remember I was very pleased with the way that it had gone. Connie was very happy with the overall show, but wasn't very happy about a couple of the little bits with her as the philosopher. And I said, don't worry, we can redo those. The main thing is we basically got the show right. And one or two of my closest friends who know my work well were very pleased with it and encouraged me a lot, so that I felt that we were all right. We were onto something good. Once I finished with Python, all I knew, oddly enough, is that I wanted to do something with Connie Booth. We were married at the time. And I didn't know what, but I went and talked to Jimmy Gilbert, who was the head of Light Entertainment, and I said, I'd like to do something with Connie. And he said, fine, we'll go, you know, come back with an idea. And I went back and I said to Connie, they'd like us to do a pilot. What shall we do? And we spent about 20 minutes deciding we couldn't do the sort of Mike Nichols, Elaine May stuff, because that had been done, and also very well done by the two Johns and Eleanor Bron. And then I said, what about that hotel we'd stayed in? Because when Connie had been occasionally doing parts in Python, she'd come down to Torquay and she had stayed at this amazing hotel run by Mr. Sinclair. It was called the Glen Eagles Hotel. He was the rudest man I've ever met. He was wonderful. And all the other Pythons wouldn't put up with it. They moved out and went to stay in the Imperial. And he was so extraordinarily rude. I mean, one day we were all at dinner, and Terry Gilliam was eating as Americans do. That is to say, they cut the meat like this, and then they cut it all up, and then they put the knife there, pick the fork up in the right hand, and spear the meat. And he was walking by, and he looked down at Terry, with this look of astonishment across his face, and he said, we don't eat like that in this country, he said. And on another occasion, Eric Idle left his briefcase by the front door in the morning, because we'd had to wait for the cab, and he forgot it. And then in the evening he got back, he said, I left my briefcase. Mr. Sinclair said, yes, it's the far side of the wall. And Eric looked out at the main entrance where he was pointing, and there was the swimming pool. The far side of the swimming pool, there was a wall. He said, well, you mean the other side of the wall? He said, what? He said, Eric said, well, what do you think, why did you put it there? And Sinclair said, we thought it might be a bomb. And Eric was astounded, because this was pre-69, pre the resumption of the IRA bombing. And Eric said, well, why a bomb? And Mr. Sinclair said, well, we've had some staff problems recently. So he thought somebody was coming to blow up his hotel. So this extraordinary man was very, very big in my memory and Connie's. And within a very short time, we'd figured out that was where we wanted to set the hotel. But the interesting thing is, nobody thought it was a good idea. All the expert advice we got was, well, he's going to be very claustrophobic in the hotel, you know, he must try and get outside. And when we wrote the first script, there's a famous memo, which the current head of Light Entertainment has on the wall of his office, saying that this is a very boring situation, and the script has nothing but very cliched characters. And I cannot see anything but a disaster if we go ahead with it. But that's on the wall. And a great friend of mine, Ian Johnston, who helped me write Fierce Creatures, heard three producers at the bar say, oh dear, have you seen this new script, Please? Oh, terrible, why do you ever leave Monty Python? So it's kind of fascinating that when you try and do something new, as William Goldman, the screenwriter, says, nobody knows. Nobody ever knows whether it's going to work or not. There was no immediate positive critical reaction. I think the Daily Mirror said Long John short on jokes after the second episode, and one of the Edinburgh papers said it was very poor. And then there was a sort of a rumble of fairly positive reaction towards the end. And then the second, when they repeated it for the second time, that's when suddenly it started to take off. But my experience has always been that if you do something that is original, it takes a little time for any kind of momentum to build up. Connie and I had no idea that it was going to have the impact that it did. I mean, I always assumed it might pick up half the Python audience. And of course, the Python audience was not that huge. It was rather smart because it was very much the comedy of ideas. But Fawlty Towers was much more a comedy of emotion, and more people were able to plug into it. So as far as I remember, we got quite substantially bigger audience figures than Python. But we had no idea. We were just writing this little thing that we thought was funny. And when you hear years later that it is liked all over the world, there's a kind of puzzlement about why it traveled. And I guess that the reason it travels is that the characters are in some way archetypes. They're the types who crop up in all the different cultures. But I have to say there's a slightly different reaction in this country from what there is in other countries. In this country, a certain number of people assume that I must be Basil. They do not see that this is a kind of a performance. They forget that Connie wrote it with me. They kind of think that I wrote it and I just wrote myself and I performed myself. This doesn't happen in other countries. In America, for example, people accept that it was a bit of writing and performing like any other performance. And I think it's because I caught something about the British character that was so essential to a certain kind of lower middle class conglomeration of attitudes that it struck home and caused me to be identified with this wretched character, this awful man, ever since. I just stayed in a hotel last week in Jersey that was run entirely for the convenience of the staff. And that's an attitude that has permeated a lot of British institutions. We've got better. We have actually learned from the Americans, who are very good at this kind of thing. But one of the points I was trying to make with Manuel was not that Manuel was some kind of an idiot or something. That wasn't it at all. What annoyed me when I went into a lot of British hotels and restaurants, particularly one particular chain of steakhouses, is that almost nobody there spoke any English at all. So that the chances of you getting what you ordered were about 1 in 6. And I knew what that was about. That was not about the fact that foreigners were stupid. It was about the fact the owners were not prepared to pay proper salaries. So they got people who were desperate for any kind of work. They did not bother to train them. They did not bother to make sure that they could speak English properly. And that was the fundamental joke about Basil and Manuel, because Manuel is one of the sweetest people. You know, he's always trying to get it right. There's no way you can blame him except that his English is not quite as good as it might be, and that's Basil's fault, because Basil doesn't pay to give him extra, English lessons as he should. Connie and I were literally there sitting next to each other all the time that it was written. I never did any writing on my own. Connie never did any on her own. We were always there together. And I think I learned a lot about the process of writing. I learned that some days it flows and other days it doesn't. And that you mustn't become too despairing on the days when it doesn't work, because a good day will be coming up. And although you can never tell which is which, you can kind of average it, that over a week you'll probably have 3 days when it's flowing reasonably well, 2 days when it isn't. So you can almost estimate how much you're going to write in a week, although you don't know what it's going to be like on any particular day. And that enables you to relax, because when you have the bad day, you think, oh, this is not inspired today, maybe we'll have a good day tomorrow. But there was an extraordinary emotional reaction we used to have when we used to think of things that would happen to Basil. Because in a sense, we were like gods playing with this man's life. And sometimes when we would think of what would happen next, we would howl with laughter. And then we would think, oh, poor man, Because as somebody pointed out years ago, comedy is very like tragedy. It's just a question of whether you're sympathetic to the people who are suffering, or whether you're standing back a bit and laughing at them. Henri Bergson said, comedy requires a momentary anesthesia of the heart. you have to be a little bit cool towards the people that you're watching, even if there's a fundamental affection before you can laugh at them. Otherwise, all you do is, oh, poor man, oh, terrible. But we had that double reaction. We'd laughed first, and then we would feel sorry for him. I've always had a tremendous love for farce. And I think it's because what I like to do more than anything else is to really laugh. You don't do it so much as you get older, but in your teenage years, there are some times when you just laugh, and you laugh so much that it hurts, and you wish you could stop laughing. Wonderful feeling. You don't get that so much as you get older, although you get it a little bit on stage. Like as a kid, you get it in church, because it's kind of forbidden, and that gives it an extra sweetness. Similarly, on stage, if somebody breaks you up, that business about trying not to laugh, that gives it a certain sweetness, and it can become almost convulsive again. The thing about farce is that everything is happening in an exaggerated way. That although you may start it quite low-key and quite real, it kind of winds up, and people get more and more frantic. They may be trying to keep the frantic feelings in and try and present some sort of calm facade to someone they have to impress. But you know that inside they're like this. And what I love is the intensity, the emotion, because with that comes more frantic behavior, more energy, and the possibility of huge laughs. I mean, I think the best evenings of my life have almost all been spent at the National Theatre when they do farces, like the Fado farces. So what a lot of people haven't spotted is that Fawlty Towers are just little 30-minute farces that start very, very low-key and finish up absolutely frantic. And the problem would be if you tried to make a movie of that over 90 minutes, you couldn't just do that because it doesn't work. Audience psychology won't allow you to do that. Great comedy is always about things happening on different levels, because people say that comedy is about conflict, and people often think that means that character A has got to be head-to-head with character B. But the interesting conflicts are within people when something has happened which is absolutely terrible, but they're having to pretend that it's fine. But if you see them just thinking it's terrible, it's not funny. It's the fact they have to keep up the act. So any time that someone is doing something at one level and something almost contradictory in conflict with it is happening at another level, it's funny. I was always fascinated by comedy, and it's very strange when I look back at it. I can actually remember being ill in bed when I was 12 and using a school exercise book to write a script for 2 radio comics whom I used to listen to at that time. And when I was at Clifton, we used to have this little blue book with all the information in. And every time I heard a good joke, I used to write it, on the white bits that didn't have print on. So there was something odd going on. And when I watched comedy, I used to watch an enormous number of American sitcoms in the mid-50s, like George Burns and Gracie Allen, Jack Benny, Phil Silvers, Amos and Andy, Joan Davis. A lot of them were American, the majority. I realize in retrospect it was almost as though I was studying them or trying to understand what was going on in some way. But the whole point was, if you came from Weston-super-Mare, you didn't go into show business. You became an accountant or a lawyer or possibly sold insurance. I mean, there were no other possibilities. So although I'd done some entertainments at school and I'd done sketches in front of audiences and quite enjoyed it, although I was terribly scared in terms of stage fright, I got to Cambridge and I got into the Footlights completely by accident, but found I could make people laugh. But I had no intention still of going into show business, because in those days, 62, 63, people from Cambridge didn't think of doing it. Within 3 years, all the people who went to Cambridge were practically planning to go into show business if they had those kind of talents. And what happened was I did the Footlights show, which was a kind of, like in America, the Hasty Pudding show at Harvard, a review show lasting 2 hours, and I did that in 62, and I thought it was terribly good, which it wasn't, but I thought it was terribly good. So in 63, I very nearly didn't do the show, especially because I hadn't done much work that year, and I thought I might fail the exams. But I did it in the end. And to my surprise, one day, after I got off stage and went up to the Footlights Club room to have a drink, there were 2 very nice men in dark suits who said, "How would you like to come and work for the BBC as a writer and a producer?" Because they'd noticed that I'd written the material. Interesting. Not the performer side, but the writing side. And I said, well, why not? And I thought about it. I could sell it to my parents because it was the BBC. So there was a pension plan. You know, it was like joining the civil service. And from a money point of view, they were offering me £30 a week. And if I had gone into the law, which is what I was studying at Cambridge, I'd have got £12 a week. And I wasn't very attached to the law, so I was out of there. I loved the first series of Python. It was one of the most exciting times of my life because it was as though someone had opened the gate to a field of flowers that no one had picked before, and you were able to sort of gambol through the gate, and there were flowers everywhere. We'd entered a new territory, and it was as though almost everything we thought of for about a year seemed or felt original. And then what happened, which always happens in comedy, is that you started to feel, or I started to feel, that we were repeating ourselves. And by the second series, I was making noises along the lines of, hey guys, aren't we repeating ourselves? And I could identify a lot of the sketches. I'd say, well, that sketch is that from the first series, plus that from the first series, plus a little bit of that from the second series. So I felt we were just permutating and combining the material we'd already done. And I didn't feel there was any point in doing that. But the others were happy. And they didn't actually really listen to me. And then I wasn't so crazy about a third series, and I agreed to sort of the first 6 or 7. And then they put a lot of pressure on me, and I kind of agreed to the whole series of 13. But I felt in the third series that I only wrote with Graham Chapman 2 things that were genuinely original. One was the cheese shop, and the other was the Highwayman, Dennis Moore. Everything else I could say to you, it's a mixture of that and that. We were repeating ourselves. And I get very bored. I don't want to repeat myself. So eventually I said to the guys, I don't want to do any more television. And 2 of them were very cross with me, but that was because they were insecure about their future outside the group. Basil always tries to get something done on the cheap. My father was a tiny little bit like this. He would always come back in if Mother had asked him to get some ham. He would always come back and she would say, this isn't the usual ham. And he would say, no, that's the, they have some special Norwegian ham in this week. They recommend it very highly. It says it's better than the ordinary stuff. He always knew it was cheaper. And he would always buy pairs of shoes that looked slightly odd, that would fall apart after 3 weeks. So he was always trying to save money. And that was all about builders, and we used, Mr. Stubbs is there because we were great friends with Nicky Henson and Imogen Stubbs, and Mr. Stubbs was Imogen's father, who was a builder and who helped us. And then, I mean, I don't mean he played the part, but I mean that was why the part was named like that. And we got a lot of technical stuff about RSJs or something, I remember, which it's very good if you can get that right. And I like doing those little bits of research. And that was quite a good episode. I quite liked that episode, but I think that they got quite a lot better. You know, it's always struck me, and I don't know if the British newspapers carry this out, but people who aren't getting enough sex are fascinated by it, even if the fascination takes the form of being very, very cross that other people are getting some. And that's obviously Basil's problem. I mean, I'm not quite sure when he and Sybil last did it, but it's a very, very long time ago, somewhere around the Second Punic War, I suspect. And the essence of that was all about how disapproving he is and how he tries to catch them at it. And I enjoy very much the degree of how he gets worked up. You know, when people were saying, I'm not a prude but, which always means I am a prude and it was an exploration of all that stuff. He could never handle anything actually sexual, but he quite likes going into a sort of 1920s, slightly sort of, very slightly sophisticated, and sort of trying to play with it all without, you know, be terrified if the thing actually turned into reality, which is what happens. Then he has no idea how to handle it at all. But a little sort of graceful 1920s style flirtation is something that he can manage quite well, and probably was what attracted Sybil to him in the first place. Manuel took a lot of knocks, yes. But the truth is, if you do this kind of comedy, you expect to. I was forever snagging my finger on door handles and tripping on the little brass strip at the bottom of it so that I'd stub my toe and hitting my... It's like playing football. I mean, you're going to get kicked here and there. And if you're doing fast, a lot of physical, you're going to get banged. 2 bad things happened to Andrew. One was in the episode where there's the fire drill, which is the same episode as the Germans. Most people think they're separate. There was a jacket that someone fixed in the special effects department to smoke, and I'm very sorry to say that some of the acid they used to get the jacket to smoke actually got through the other side of the jacket onto Andrew's skin and kind of burned him. And actually the BBC paid him some damages. It was a bad mistake. I mean, a very bad mistake by the special effects department. And the other was my fault. We'd been practicing all week with me hitting him with a saucepan. And I don't know why we didn't get a rubber saucepan. You know, when I did Third Rock from the Sun recently, we had a rubber saucepan one. I hit John Lithgow. It looked very good. They put a bong on it. He went out like a light. Nobody knows the difference. But in this case, I had a big one. I was trying to hit Andrew a sort of sliding blow like that. And just as I started, he straightened up. And I caught him a terrible one. And I'm afraid he had a headache for about 2 days. But Andrew's sensible enough to know that that's going to happen. It's like football, as I say, you're going to get kicked sometimes. When we were recording them, it was so frantic, you know. We'd go in the studio, I can't remember, let's say on the Wednesday, and then on the Thursday, there'd be the read-through for the next one. So in retrospect, all I remember really is a bit of a blur. It's just like Monty Python. I mean, we spent all those days, weeks, months in the Old Oak Common Working Men's Club. And I can remember almost nothing about it, except there was a smell of stale beer every morning when we arrived. And I can't even remember the room. But I remember the filming, because every time we went off filming on Python, we go to a different location. And when you're in a different location, everything's fresh and you remember it. So I can remember being in Bradford, I can remember being in Jersey and Torquay and all these places quite clearly, and lots of incidents that happened, but nothing about the rehearsal room because it was utterly routine and fairly frenzied. So my feelings about the episodes now are all to do with the quality of the episodes. And as I watch them now, I've become aware that some are almost better than I thought. And one or two are slightly disappointing. I was just a bit disappointed with the dead body last time I saw it. I just thought there were a few bits that were slightly repetitive that should just have been tightened up a bit. On the other hand, I thought the psychiatrist and Basil the Rat, which I've seen in the last 12 months, were both very, very funny. I watched the Basil the Rat last Sunday at a fundraising thing, and there's a moment when they're just looking under the table while a young upper-class guy is trying to give the order. And it's terribly funny, and I don't know why. It's just the fact that he's chattering away, and all they're interested in is whether anyone can spot where the rat is. And it's very simple, but it's unbelievably funny. So I'm sometimes caught in retrospect. I get it wrong. Things are funnier or less funnier than I remember them. There are some comedians, and when you meet them, all they do is basically cabaret. And it's fine for about 45 minutes, then it's usually rather boring after that, because you can't really make any contact with them. That's the way they want it, though. That's why some of them do it that way. But for me, I'd just rather have an ordinary transaction with someone. And I think after a time, when you've done a few interviews, people get a very vague feeling about you. It may be sort of accurate emotionally. Factually, people get things wonderfully screwed up. I mean, I remember walking on the street once and somebody coming up to me and said, "Oh, yeah, I understand you're a friend of Mr. Smith." And I said, "What?" He said, "You know Mr. Smith?" I thought, what are they talking about? They said, "Alcoholics Anonymous." I said, well, it's a code thing. I said, "Well, I'm not an alcoholic." "Oh, I'm so sorry," they said. You think, why did they think? And they thought, well, maybe Graham Chapman, you see. Alcoholic. Did they get us confused? And then an old girlfriend of mine was in Amsterdam, that's right, doing a commercial, and there was a young English woman at dinner afterwards who was chatting about Charles and Di, had all the latest stuff, and my name came up, and she said, "Oh yes, John Clesse, he's gay." My old girlfriend listened to this for 5 minutes and then said, "Well, I knew him quite well, and it wasn't quite the impression I got you." So you sometimes wonder what odd rumours are circulating out there. Even there used to be a rumour that Danny LaRue was married with lots of kids. You're going to think, well, how did that get started? And of course, once people have heard a rumour, they tend to think that it's true, sort of gerbils, if you see what I mean. Is there any truth there? I'll never know, you'll never know. But they just keep circulating, and sometimes you think, I wonder what people do believe about me. When my friends and I started, on the whole, we had a slightly low opinion of catchphrases, because there used to be certain BBC radio comedy shows that consisted entirely of catchphrases. You know, you'd hear the door open and someone would come in and say, I won't take my coat off, I'm not stopping. You know, there'd be, about 4 minutes. When the laugh faded, another door would open and someone would come in and say, I don't like cauliflower, I prefer the pea. So we got very fed up with it. It seemed to us there was nothing to do with comedy at all. It was some kind of in-joke that people enjoyed simply because they felt part of the in-crowd. It was nothing to do with humour at all. But what happens, of course, is that, of course, dear Manuel says "que" a lot because he's no idea what's going on. It was never intended to be a catchphrase. He said, what else would he say? Do you see what I mean? But sometimes I think we realised that I am from Barcelona kind of got funnier with repetition. But there was almost no intention of creating catchphrases. And oddly enough, the lines that I remember are very frequently not the ones that other people remember. There's a line in the Wizzo Chocolate Factory sketch about Crunchy Frog. There's a line when Inspector Praline says, where's the pleasure in that? And that's a phrase that I often want to say to people when they talk about the fact they've been mountaineering for 4 weeks. I always want to say, where is the pleasure in that? And there's another one which is in the pet shop sketch, the dead parrot. When I say, I see, I get the picture. And I sometimes think of that, I see, I get the picture. But these are not the phrases that other people pick up. And sometimes I discover that something's become a catchphrase and I didn't even know it. I think that Prue began to develop a laugh, and I think she and I talked about it a bit at one point, because I remember it was, no, deeper than that. And I described it in one script as somebody machine gunning a seal, which is a very good description. But I think that was something, again, we worked on. And that was the delight of going into the shows after we'd done one or two, and we were able to borrow from what the actors and actresses were beginning to create, and we were beginning to incorporate that in the script. And I sometimes think that television critics have absolutely no understanding of the process of comedy at all, because they will nearly always write a very full review of the first show, which is, I think, pretty dim. The time that a critic should start to take a show really seriously and offer carefully thought out criticisms is about number 4 on the first series, not before that. But of course they don't know that, because although sometimes critics are able to say whether something is good or bad with a certain amount of expertise, what almost none of them understands is the process. Because they can't do it, and you have to always remember that, because if they could do it, they would be doing it, not writing about it. Because they can't do it, they have a right to express opinions about whether it's good or bad and compare it with other work. But they get into very deep water when they try to apportion blame or praise, because they don't really know who does what. Now, if I go to a play, a comedy, and I'm still not sure at my stage whether it's the script or the acting that isn't right, or the direction, how do they know so well? I honestly don't think they understand it better than I do. But I guess journalism is about, by and large, pretending that you know more about things than you actually do. It's sort of the essence of it. Because in Britain, at any rate, a journalist who says, I'm not quite sure about this, perhaps that, like a more human and honest way of expressing himself, isn't really very highly valued by most of the editors. Fawlty Towers took a little time to get started. It didn't pick up a very big audience the first series. It's suddenly on the repeats. You got the impression something was happening, some kind of groundswell of approval was happening. The critics began to quite like it towards the end of the first series. And after that, on the whole, the criticisms were very good. But Connie and I found doing the second series probably as difficult as anything we'd done, because the hardest thing in this business is to deal with unreal expectations. I mean, the problem with Fierce Creatures was not Fierce Creatures. The problem with Fierce Creatures was Fish Called Wanda. People thought not only that it was going to be as funny, which is unlikely because at the time it was arguably as successful as any British film ever made, so lightning was not likely to strike in the same place twice. But there was also a feeling it would be in the same style, and because it was not in the same style, people couldn't see what style it was in. Now, the problem we had with the second series of Fawlty Towers is that the expectation was unreasonably high, because I realized that people were already remembering the first series as better than it was. Because if there's 3 or 4 things in the first series that are really funny, the audience remembers that as the kind of general standard rather than the highlights. Then they expect the second series to be at the highlight level all the way through. So it was a huge effort to get those scripts as good as I think they finally were. About 6 weeks each. So that's 6 sixes, 36 weeks writing. You see 1 week of filming and then 6 weeks in the studio, 1 week per episode. So it was a 43-week shoot for which I was paid the princely sum of £9,000. Not quite retirement money, but there were repeats. Connie and I found the second series so demanding. We just didn't want to take the task on again. And also we felt that we'd been there. In a flippant moment, I said, well, Shakespeare only got 4 hours out of Hamlet. We got 6 hours out of Basil. We felt that the audience was getting to know the characters so well that they'd get to the point of the joke before us. They would get ahead of us. But basically, it was about the fact we felt we'd done it. Some people thought it was something to do with the fact that we'd split up, but in fact we split up between the first series and the second series. We were separated by the time we did the second series. And I don't think that show business or any of that stuff was anything to do with the fact that we separated. A lot of people thought it was to do with the tensions of show business. I don't think it had anything to do with it at all. I think it was the right decision, and oddly enough, the time we spent together, I think we both view very positively. But some relationships, as Tom Stoppard said, all relationships have a clock attached to them. Well, you really see what an awful man Basil is, because he has no interest in other human beings as human beings at all. They are either objects of derision and scorn, or an opportunity to improve his position in the social hierarchy. And in this particular case, it's the professional hierarchy. You know, can he get a good recommendation for his hotel? And I love the idea that by having different people arriving and him never quite knowing which one of them was the inspector or not, he would switch from one way of addressing them to another and back again without any kind of consistency, so that you could see really what a bastard he was. I mean, that's the thing about Basil. He's an absolutely awful human being. But the strange thing about comedy is that if an awful character makes people laugh, think of W.C. Fields, people feel affectionate towards him. It's insane, because if they had to sit next to him for 5 minutes at a dinner, they would absolutely not be able to cope with him. They would loathe him. But because he makes them laugh, they think deep down he's all right, and he isn't. The essence of farce is almost always that some kind of taboo has been transgressed, and the protagonist has to cover up. So he does one lie to cover up. And of course, as he seems to get caught out in that lie, then he has to switch to a slightly different lie, and then to a third, and then back to the first, by which time that doesn't work. And you just get bogged down in worse and worse degrees of lying. It's a bit like Watergate, really. You know, if somebody told the truth to begin with, there wouldn't be a problem. But it multiplies exponentially once you told the first lie that doesn't work. I think the great secret is that the scripts were very good, and they were very good, I think, for 2 reasons. One is, for a start, that there was an awful lot in them. The average BBC half hour, 65 pages. Fawlty Towers, we used to do 135 to 140 pages. We literally did twice as many. Camera cuts, average shows got 200. We used to have 400 camera cuts. So there was an enormous amount in there. The other thing is they were very well constructed, and what Connie and I discovered worked for us was that we never really started to write the dialogue until we got the plot worked out. So we would spend sometimes as much as 2.5 weeks on a plot. Not always the same one, because if we got stuck, we'd sometimes put it to one side and pick up another one that we were halfway through and try and run with that. But we never really bothered to write the dialogue, as I said, until we'd really got the story worked out in considerable detail. You always have to change it a bit, because you can never visualize it all when you've just got the storyline there, and you'll find that one scene that you'd imagine doesn't work because Basil comes into it in a different frame of mind or in a different mood from what you need. So you're always having to rejig it a bit. But that was the key. We never started until we had the story, so we always knew where we were going. Some people try to write comedy by starting scene one and they start writing the dialogue. Well, the chances of them getting to a satisfactory ending are 1 in 100. You've got to kind of know where you're going while you're building the thing. One of the characteristics of those episodes is that there's always one key idea. But what we often tried to do along with that key idea was to have 1 or 2 other subplots, other threads running. And they would run parallel for a time, and then hopefully they would become intertwined. And by the end, the last 5 minutes, they would all come together. That's what we managed to do in the best of the episodes. But the most useful thing we used to do was to ask people for ideas, people who were in the business. For example, Connie and I were on holiday in Monte Carlo for 2 weeks, and we met a very nice woman who was just sort of helping us with the hotel, and we had coffee with her. And we said to her, what's the most difficult kind of guest that you have? And she described Mrs. Richards absolutely perfectly. And we wrote it all down, the fact that they always complain about everything, but they don't want it changed, they just want a reduction. And this business of strategic deafness, hearing what they want to hear. And she just gave us a character portrait. All the BBC shows at that time were always recorded with a live audience, and it was kind of understood that you didn't use any kind of sweetening, you didn't use any kind of canned laughter. We did sometimes, and I'll tell you what we did, occasionally you'd have something on film, and the audience would of course have to watch that on the monitors, and then that would cut back to the studio, and the audience would still be watching the monitors, and they would fail to see that we were supposed to be back in the studio. And sometimes you would find that there would be a complete silence after a joke because the audience is looking in the wrong place, or they're still looking in the studio when they should be looking up the monitor. And then we used to take one of our own laughs off the soundtrack and put it in the place if it needed it. But I said to the actors very early on, I had a theory about this. I said, we're not going to play this at the pace of the studio audience. I said, we don't have to. In the theatre, you have to go at the pace of the audience because they can't hear you otherwise. You have to wait for that laughter to curve, the laughter curve to come down. Then you start speaking again. But in television, you have this wonderful thing called a microphone that's there. And if you talk into the mic while the audience is still laughing, then the wonderful thing is that people at home can hear it. So you can keep the pace up. And when people are watching at home, there's only 1 or 2 of them. It's not like being in an audience in a theatre, so they don't laugh as much. So what you have to do is play it faster when people are, at home in 1s and 2s than you ever would if you were doing it in front of a full audience. So we deliberately ignored the studio audience and tried to play it faster than was right for the studio audience in order to get the sufficiently rapid pace of the people at home. The second show that we did, which was about the builders, was performed almost entirely to complete silence. And it was not a very comfortable experience. And afterwards, I was a bit disturbed. And people said, no, it was a funny show. Actually, I think it's the least good of the 10 shows, or 12 shows. But, they said, no, it was fine, it was funny. I said, well, what about the audience? And they said, well, we don't know. We found out later that a large number of people from the Icelandic Broadcasting Corporation had visited the BBC that day. And the BBC were always helpful to shows like mine. Thought, wouldn't it be nice if we put all 70 of them in the front row? And they sat there being very pleasant and charming and Icelandic and not laughing at all, just this faint whiff of cod coming from the front row, which had we recognised might have given us the explanation. And I've got to say, it was a pretty tough recording, and it needed quite a lot of editing to tighten it up. But the BBC do things like this to you sometimes. We used to do the entire recording between, let me get it right, between 8 and 10 in the evening. We would get into the studio that day at about 9:30, start in front of cameras at 10 and go through to 6. So they were long days, and I was a lot younger. I mean, I remember for the second series, I got fit. I used to go for runs. It took a lot of energy for two reasons. First of all, it was a big expenditure of energy actually during the course of the show. But the rehearsal, you see, we only had 5 days to get it right. The 5 days was not a great deal to learn it. The first day would be the read-through, and you'd start putting it on its feet. You'd start figuring, all right, well, Sybil's there and I'm at the desk. The second day, you'd finish putting it on your feet. So you only had 3 days to go to rehearse it. You see what I mean? Then by the third day, little bits of it were beginning to work because people were getting to know the lines. But then you come in for the fourth and fifth days. Usually there was a weekend in the middle which helped because you could spend the whole weekend learning. But then the fourth and fifth days, you were absolutely flat out because there was a great deal to learn, not just the words, but all the business. You have to figure out exactly what the business is and then remember it and practice it so that it's really quick. And Andrew and I, you know, are good at physical comedy, but it was exhausting because there was so much of it to do. The timing is all important, and the hardest thing is to get it well enough rehearsed. Now, 5 days was never really enough, plus the day in the studio, to get it right. And what happened was that we did anything between 20 and 25 hours editing on each show. Almost every minute you see up on the screen, we spent 1 hour editing. And it was only by doing that that you could just tighten it up and just tighten it there and take out a line of dialogue there and sometimes take out a repetition there or then lose 2 lines of dialogue there. That's what really got the pace on it. And there wasn't time to get it that good in terms of just the rehearsal period and the studio recording. It felt to me very much like a team because in the first series, John Howard Davis, second series, Bobby Spears, and Prue, and Andrew and Connie and I listened to each other a great deal. And people, you know, if I was doing a scene with, let's say, with Sybil, with Prue, then Connie and Andrew would just sit there watching, and after a time, they might easily, Andrew might say, what about that? Or that isn't quite working. But because Connie and I had written and then rewritten the scripts, there wasn't an enormous amount of script rewriting. They were more or less right most of the time. But how we did them was very much a cooperative thing with lots of suggestions coming in. And I just did an American show, Third Rock from the Sun, and it was lovely. It was just like Fawlty Towers again, with about 6 key people giving ideas and nobody bothering whether their idea was accepted or not. It was just that sense of making it as good as possible. We saw Basil as someone who was tremendously class conscious, who was always trying to become a little bit grand, who adopted attitudes of superiority over people that were really quite unjustified, and someone who was fundamentally terrified of his wife. So if you look at the episodes, they're almost all fueled by the fact that he is trying to hide something from Sybil. Very, very basic. Sybil, Connie and I had a different conception. I can't remember now, through the mists of time, what it was. But we had a different conception of the character from the way Prue played it at the first read-through. And I remember going home and saying to Connie, what do you think about the way Prue's playing it? And I was saying, well, it's not what we thought of. We were a bit worried, and then after about 2 days, we actually saw that what she was doing was better and worked better than the way that we thought it would be played. And so that helped us, because when we came to write the second episode and the rest of them, we began to have her voice in our ear, which we didn't have when we wrote the first one. When we handed the first script in, there were a lot of theoretical questions about, you know, why are they together? And I remember being puzzled by that. I said, I think to Jimmy Gilbert, I said, you look at all your friends, do you have any idea why any of them are together? And he said, no, I suppose not. Sometimes people worry about things like that. When we were writing Fish Called Wanda, we spent ages agonizing over what was Kevin Kline's character, Otto's backstory? Where did he come from? What had he done? It's never mentioned in the film. We never know anything about where he came from, what he used to do. It doesn't bother anyone. So a lot of those questions don't matter. The fact is, most people, as far as I could make out, are married because of some strange historical accident. It is no longer explicable logically. you know, and they were there and they are together, and there's that kind of mutual dependence. Sybil, I think, is much, much stronger and more independent than Basil. She could really function perfectly well if Basil buzzed off or fell under a bus. I don't think Basil could. I think he's much more dependent on Sybil, and that's why he's much more frightened of her than she is of him. Getting Connie's character right was not too difficult because she is the sensible one. But she's also Basil's confidant. When he gets in terrible trouble, he will go to Polly and say, this has happened and this is what I have to achieve. And it's terribly useful as a writing device to have somebody once described her as Horatio to Hamlet. You know, it's wonderful to have someone that the protagonist can go to and say, this is what I have just done and this is what I'm going to do next if there's any doubt about what's happening in the plot. She, in the pilot episode, was a philosophy student, and we didn't feel that that worked as well as art students, so we re-recorded just a little, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and cut that in to the first episode before it was transmitted to the general public. And then Andrew, I'd seen Andrew in a marvelous play by John Mortimer called Habeas Corpus, and he had just made me laugh till I hurt, and I realized how good he was at physical comedy. And so I got him, and this just touched something in him because he's so quiet. He's immensely thoughtful, extraordinarily kind man, very considerate, and that rather quiet, almost introverted. And then you put that moustache on him, and he goes, ding! And this energy explodes, and it's you know, something just comes through that you don't normally see. And at the beginning, I wrote most of Basil and most of Manuel, and Connie wrote most of Sybil and most of Polly. And I found it very interesting because I'd sometimes suggest lines for Sybil, and she'd say, no, a woman would never say that. And I'd think, But gradually, she started to write more of Basil, and I started to write more of Sybil. And then we just kind of cooperated more and more on all the characters. Then the one the two of us loved the most was the Major. We loved this guy who was in his own world. He never quite understood what was going on, but always added his own insane interpretation of it. And Ballard Berkeley, he's no longer with us. I was hugely fond of him. He was a wonderful fellow. And having had a very distinguished career, it was lovely that right towards the end of it, he had this huge hit. But he was like me, he was an insane cricket fan. And when I'd be in the rehearsal room, playing a scene with Sybil, I'd glance over Sybil's shoulder and I'd suddenly see Ballard doing this, which meant that there were 6 Australian wickets down. And I just loved that man. And then the old ladies were absolutely terrific. And it was a very happy group because everybody was very pleased with what they had to do. Nobody was trying to build their part up. You know, everyone was happy. So that was good. And then each week you'd have some guests in. And I have to say that John Howard Davies, directed the first series, was marvelous at casting because he came up with Prue and he came up with a lot of the actors that we used in that first series. Basil in Gourmet Night is desperately trying to improve the tone of the hotel. He doesn't want any riffraff there. I love the fact he says in the advertisement, no riffraff. He thinks he could get the cream of Torquay society along and sort of improve his professional chances, perhaps get invited to dinner with some of these people. And he's at his fawning worst. Now the interesting thing is we decided to get the chef absolutely plastered, and yet shortly after the episode I went to a very good restaurant in Cambridge and they'd had a similar emergency on their first night, which was they'd been cooking for a certain amount of time and had friends in and so forth and had trial meals, sort of dress rehearsals, and on the night in question in the late afternoon the gas company cut off the gas because in the excitement and frenzy of opening the restaurant, they quite simply forgotten to pay the bill. So that was a neater way of getting to the stage where you don't have any way of cooking the meal properly and how you have to go to the restaurant down the town than the one we came up with. And it's interesting that reality often provides you with the best situations. I mean, in Fish Called Wanda, the situation where the family walked in and I'm there naked actually more or less happened to my closest friend. He was given the key to a flat in London by an upper-class family who hardly ever used it, and they said, Alan, anytime you're in town, do use the flat, we hardly use it. And about 6 months later, he was going to a black tie thing, and he went to the flat dressed there, and then he went back afterwards and poured himself a whiskey and went to have a bath. And after a time, he heard the door open, and he didn't bother him at all because it was his friends. And there was a knock on the door, and who is in there? And he said, Alan, and the voice said, Alan who? And he realized he didn't recognize the voice. And of course, the family had sold the flat and not told Alan. The interesting thing about the beating the car sequence is how technical it is. It took a very long time to find a branch that was right. We tried beating it with a fairly rigid branch, and it wasn't funny at all. And we tried beating it with a floppy branch, and that didn't work. And then we finally got a branch that had the right degree of flexibility, and it became terribly funny. And it showed that now, no matter how good an idea is, there's always an enormous amount of getting it right technically, which nobody knows unless they actually do it. People always talk about in the abstract as though any branch would have been funny. Similarly, when he's cursing the car, it is much funnier that sound is kind of contained, as though it's coming from inside a sort of goldfish bowl, than if you heard it at full volume from inside the car. Often you don't know why these things are the case, and you just have to stumble around trying things until you discover what works. Ironically, I never think that the second half of that episode, which is the Germans, is as well written as all that. There's several things in it that I think are wrong, whereas I think the fire drill, the first half of it, is written beautifully. But I suppose the point was we got onto wonderful subject matter. But the point I was trying to make, and this is absolutely true, was that people like Basil are utterly stuck in the past. If you looked at the Germans, all the people that he was interacting with are much too young to have had anything to do with the Second World War. And therefore, it was much more about the fact that Basil was stuck in the past than it was trying to make fun of the Germans. It wasn't trying to make fun of the Germans at all, because they were actually behaving very reasonably all through. And I think only one of them gets a bit angry at the end, and that's after Basil's made his wife cry. So the whole point of it was about these extraordinary attitudes of people who are still hanging on to the Second World War. If they were in the war, if they saw bad things, then of course they're going to hang on to it, rather as the Japanese do. I mean, the Japanese prisoners of war do. I had enormous sympathy for them. I don't know how you let go of things when you've seen friends beheaded and stuff like that. But the fact is, the rest of us don't have to go with that. The rest of us could let it go. I've always been fascinated by people trying to communicate and not being able to. If you think of the stuttering scene in Fish Called Wanda, where Michael's trying to get the information across to me and can't, that's one end of it. Another situation is when two people are trying to understand each other and they're just not using the right words. They keep just missing and going past each other. I've always found that funny. I don't know why I find it so funny, but I always do. And I think it's fairly common. I think audiences find it funny. So the fact that he's trying to explain to them that it is not the fire bell, that it is the fire alarm, is just an opportunity for for them just to completely miss all the other. And I love the moment when he gives up and he says, I don't know why we bother anyway. We should let you all burn. Love that line. I said to a great friend of mine called Andrew Lehman, who was a restaurateur, I said, what was the worst problem you had when you used to work at the Savoy Hotel? And he said, oh, the stiffs. I said, what? He said, oh, getting rid of the stiffs. I said, well, what do you mean people died a lot? Oh, he said, oh, a lot. He said, the old dears, I'm afraid they know the Savoy will always treat them really well and do these things, so they would sometimes check in with a bottle of pills, take them in the night. In the morning, Savoy staff would walk in and pick up the dose. So we got another one. And then the problem was getting the stiffs into the service elevator without alarming the other guests. Well, once you've been given that as an idea, I mean, it's just wonderful. And then you put a doctor in the hotel, and it's a kind of a joy. Some of those worked out very well. It's interesting because sometimes we had a wonderful ending for the dead body when we couldn't use it. The guy who died and who, gets put in the basket and all that stuff, we thought it would be terribly funny if we'd established without Basil knowing that he had a twin brother. So after Basil had finally got him in the basket, the twin brother would walk in and come up to the desk, and Basil would abuse him. This mindless practical joke. And we couldn't do it because there was no way of Basil telling the twin that his brother was dead. You couldn't do that in a comedy show. You see what I mean? So it was a great shame. It would have been too difficult mixing that kind of emotion. If you think about farce, because of the high level of energy, the kind of mania involved, people have to get very wound up, and it's easier to do that in the context of subjects that make people particularly anxious, which usually means taboo. So if you look at a lot of the Fawlty Towers episodes, you'll find that one's about dead bodies, one's about rats, which people are like that about. One's about a woman who pretends that she's deaf. It's a little bit dodgy here and there. There's a lot of taboo in there. And anybody in comedy knows that if you get into taboo areas, if it's done right, two things happen which are both good. One is that you're exploring something that is a little unfamiliar and a little dangerous and a little exciting and therefore a little bit interesting. And secondly, it arouses a degree of anxiety, which means that people laugh more. I mean, the basis of sexual jokes, 99% of which are not the slightest bit funny, is that they harness people's anxiety and embarrassment about sex so that they get big laughs. As I say, very few of them I think are actually funny. But I did not feel any kind of pressure to censor the show. There were 2 jokes in the entire 12 programs which the BBC, I think it was Bill Cotton, were worried about. And by the time I got Bill's worry, one had already been cut. And the other one I was very unsure about. I think it was a reference to one of the concentration camps, just when Basil was getting very confused, the word popped up, and I was not very sure about it myself. And when Bill said, I'm worried about that, I just cut it. But we didn't have any pressure, and the PC lobby, the politically correct lobby, is something I don't understand, because a lot of what I see on television now, both here in America, seems to me much riskier than we would have got away with even in the Python days. And then at the same time, you hear about these politically correct movements, which I think are by and large run and staffed largely by obsessionals. There's a good idea at the back of political correctness, but it gets taken ad absurdum. And I think that the danger is this: if you're in a group of people and you find that one person is particularly touchy, they have difficulty controlling their emotions, greater difficulty than the other people in the group, then you can't have so much fun about them because they're touchy and they're likely to explode. So when they're around, you're not as relaxed, you're not as spontaneous, you can't be more real, you have to kind of be more formal. Now, if you find that society is being run by the touchiest members, then in a sense that's a bit sick, because you're trying to take as the general standard the standard of the people who have the greatest problem controlling their emotions in that area. My little nest of vipers, I always liked that. It was funny, you never really minded the things that Basil said to Sybil because she was never hurt by them. You see, if she'd been hurt by them, then it wouldn't have worked. There's a certain degree of discomfort that people can tolerate in comedy, but they don't want to see anyone in real pain, or at least not in this kind of comedy. Probably not in any kind of comedy. So it was water off a duck's back. She just didn't give a damn. So although the insults were funny, they were fundamentally ineffectual, and that's why we could get away with them. I've seen myself in Japanese and various other strange languages, Oriental languages, and it is incomprehensible to me how this stuff translates. But it must. I mean, I can go back many years now, and I remember once picking up the newspaper and reading that on the buses was #1 in Yugoslavia. And when I was in Germany last time, I was in Hamburg, and as I walked across the lobby of my favorite hotel there, a German shouted out to me, "Hey, Mr. Clesse, don't mention the war." I thought that was terrific. You know? I mean, that's great. It's taken a little time, but I felt really good about that. I thought it was wonderful when I heard that Fawlty Towers was being used as a training film, I think by the Hyatt chain and one other chain, in London. But it didn't really surprise me because, you see, we started Fawlty Towers. The first series is 75, and Tony J, Peter Robinson, Michael Peake and I started Video Arts in 72. So I'd already done quite a number of videos about customer relations, selling across the counter, selling services. And I had a pretty good idea by that time of how you really were supposed to treat customers. So it was very simple doing the opposite with Basil. And a lot of the time it was absolutely as simple as that. You knew what the rule was and you broke it. And sometimes you find that things happen in hotels that are so wonderfully funny and creative that you could never have thought of them. My favorite one is, you know, when you arrive in a hotel, you have this utter, what's the word, delusion that the room is in some way yours. Whereas in fact the hotel is full of people who want to get into the room. They want to restock the minibar, they want to pull the curtains, they want to turn down your bed, they want to do... So you have to remember, you walk, it's not your room, you have to put up the do not disturb sign just to get any peace at all. And on one occasion, I had about 3 interruptions, I finally put up the do not disturb sign, and 5 minutes later, as I was lying on the bed doing a crossword, I don't believe this. So I go to the door and I open the door, and there's a young man, bellhop, standing outside, pointing at the do not disturb notice, saying, "Is this supposed to be out here?" Now you couldn't make that up. And at a time I stayed in the Randolph Hotel in Oxford, and I had a very, very good dinner at Merton College. Superb dinner. Got in rather late. Went up to sleep with a late alarm call, and at 5:45, hello, this is Mr. Clesse, your alarm call. I said, no, it may well be somebody else's. It is not mine. Mine is 8:30. Thank you. And you're just in that lovely dropping off. You pick it up and say, just to apologize for waking you up. You know, there's some things you could never invent. I'm one of those people who goes very cold, very controlled, and I speak about 2/3 of my normal speed, and I sound the consonants with a little extra care, and I try to convey the impression that I am being enormously patient and really quite kind with an utter idiot. That's how I tend to express my anger. I'm not a screamer, and I probably would enjoy it if I could become one. I find myself remembering incidents, things that happen that suddenly strike me as there's a lot of comic possibilities in that. They tend to get filed away. I couldn't tell you the next week, but when I'm writing next time, they'll pop up. I'm not very observant of surface behavior in an odd way, but I think I pick up very, very quickly on people, and I'm observant of, in some way, maybe through empathy or something, of what's going on inside them. But I'm terribly unobservant. If somebody after a dinner party says to me, "What was anyone wearing?" I have absolutely no idea. I just don't take that kind of thing in. Getting the wardrobe right is very important because it can convey information about the character, obviously. But I don't think I'm particularly good at it. I certainly don't have a visual imagination. I can't say he ought to wear this or she ought to be in this kind of clothes, but I can say the feeling the clothes ought to convey is. But I tend to rely on the wardrobe person, usually in my life one wonderful woman called Hazel Pethick. And then an expert like that will know what kind of clothes will convey that impression. So many people have said to me, "You're going to do any more Fawlty Towers?" And you're up against an expectation. I could not win. I could not win. If I had to go back now, I think I probably would not do Fierce Creatures. You're up against an expectation that absolutely cannot be matched. And the thing is, do something different. I like working with the same team again and again, because if you have a good team, why break it up? But the fact is, the same team brings the same expectation. Also, trying to make Fawlty Towers work at 90 minutes would be very difficult, because as I said earlier, you can build it like that for 30 minutes, but if you're in a movie, then there has to be a trough and then another peak, and it doesn't interest me. I had an idea for a plot. I love the idea of Basil being finally invited to Spain to meet Manuel's family and getting to Heathrow and then spending about 14 hours there waiting for the flight, you know, and finally getting on the flight, being furious. And then a terrorist pulls a gun and tries to hijack the plane, and Basil is so angry he overcomes the terrorist, and when the pilot says we have to fly back to Heathrow, and Basil says no, fly us to Spain or I'll shoot you. Arrives in Spain, immediately arrested, spends the entire holiday in a Spanish jail, is released in time to go back on the plane with Sybil. But it's funny, isn't it? But I don't want to do it. I was fascinated with the idea of getting a slightly complicated episode together in which a whole series of stories depended on each other, so that if one collapsed, all the others collapsed. And for some reason we hit upon betting, which is not a very strong taboo. It's probably the weakest of the taboos. There's a Pinero play about a vicar who puts money on a horse and spends the entire 2.5 hours trying to cover up. And of course nowadays you say, why bother? So it wasn't as strong a taboo, and it's probably why it's not one of the very best episodes, but it still builds up very, very nicely, the tensions between them all. And there's a very good scene at the end when they're all standing in a line and all the lies are beginning to collapse one after another, and then kind of get built up again. I like that section very much. I think any time I see a possibility of a misunderstanding, of somebody saying someone the other or getting it wrong, I think I just jump on it. It's one of my 2 or 3 favorite kinds of humor. And I guess I'm looking for it in some way in any situation. It's about Basil's dislike of any kind of sexual behavior at all, and some very, very good lines at the beginning about how people dress. And Basil, as Sybil says, Basil's idea of a really so sexy, attractive man is Earl Haig. And she points out that he did actually wear his decorations, which is quite interesting, because it's all right in your army to have all these brightly coloured things on you, which is an interesting thought. But the key to all that is Basil's utter embarrassment about any kind of talk about emotion, and all his assumptions about what psychotherapy is. Because in the British press still, you constantly see analysis and psychotherapy attacked for what it isn't. It's very strange. I suppose it's very hard for some people who haven't been through it to understand what the process is. And maybe I've been lucky with the therapists that I've had, because there are bad therapists in the same way there are bad plumbers and bad doctors. Because you had a bad doctor doesn't mean necessarily all orthodox medicine is rubbish. The same way, if you've had a bad therapist, as I think Faye Weldon felt that her ex-husband had, it doesn't mean that all therapists and all psychotherapy is useless. But it makes people anxious, because people on the whole do not want to look at themselves. I mean, it's the first lesson in life. There's a small group of people who do want to look at themselves. Most people are pretty uncomfortable about it. And the presence of those 2 psychiatrists brings out all Basil's fears that somebody might actually start looking into what's going on inside him. The English don't know how to complain. We're so over-polite in a lot of situations that it's almost like a neurosis. I could remember sitting at a lunch table in Los Angeles once, and I saw an Englishman up the other end, and he wanted the salt. And instead of saying, could you pass the salt? Or maybe pass the salt, please. He just sat there for about 7 or 8 minutes till somebody looked to him, and he pointed and said, sorry. That was his way of asking for the salt. We're terribly apologetic, and also we go through these things about thank you. Americans can't believe when you go into a shop in England how many times the person behind the counter says thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know what it's about, and I like the fact that some Americans, not all, but some Americans are capable of being very direct in a way that achieves the object without ever seeming rude. They can just assert themselves with the right degree of energy. And the whole point about that episode is that is what Bruce Bowers, who played the American, was basically able to do. Whereas early on in the episode, you have 2 old ladies who are complaining about this dreadful meal, and when Basil comes up and says, you know, is it all right? Oh, yes, very nice, thank you. The English can't complain because they don't know how to do it. They think if they complain, it's going to somehow be aggressive and something to do with losing their temper and a loss of face. I was fascinated by the idea of trying to get Basil very happy about the fact someone had died. So we came up with the idea that he thought he'd poisoned him, and then when he discovered he hadn't poisoned him, he'd be really happy, and then the doctor could walk in when he was around shouting, "I'm so happy, I'm so happy." Again, utter ruthless selfishness. No thought for this guy or his family at all. It's just, is he on the hook or is he off the hook? As I say, he's a terrible man. And I liked that episode a lot. But when I saw it recently, I thought there were little bits in it that maybe could have been edited or be tightened up a bit. The stuff when they're standing around, when the guys arrive, the three people arrive for the meeting, and he thinks they're the undertakers, it's not quite clearly signaled enough. And so I saw one or two things in that I thought could have been better. But I still am very, very fond of it, because I love bodies in baskets. In that anniversary program, Basil actually is thinking of someone else for a short period of time before the panic overtakes him. And you do get the impression that there is something positive underneath all the other stuff between him and Sybil. And Connie and I particularly liked that episode because we felt that we were beginning to explore character a little bit more. It was a little less farcical. I remember we thought it was a little bit more in the area of Alan Ayckbourn, who we both adored. And we liked that episode a lot, and the great joy of it was we had much longer to rehearse it than we normally did, because we got about 5 days into rehearsal, and a splendid thing happened. A BBC executive got into a argument with a rigger, someone who puts the lights up, and eventually punched him. And the unions went on strike, and we couldn't record the program on the ordinary day, and it was postponed. They settled the strike, and everything was put off a week. And Julian Holloway was unable to do the second week because he had another commitment, and we brought in dear Ken Campbell, whom I've always adored. He's such a marvellous, strange, funny man. So he was the only one who was new, and we had all this time to rehearse it, and it was really, really good because everyone was able to get familiar with the show and then bring little things to it. So I think it's one of the very best episodes. I don't know whether we were deliberately trying to come up with more visual gags in the second part. It's just that the more time you have on something, the more you tend to think of visual gags. You probably don't add a great deal to the dialogue, because if that's good, you don't need any more of that. But you get more and more chance to work out little bits of business which go parallel with the dialogue, so that they're not slowing it down. They're simply making the mix richer while not losing any time. I watched Basil the Rat last Sunday as part of a sort of fundraising thing, and I was very, very pleased with it. There's a particular scene at the end when he and Manuel are talking to a young couple, and they're really not taking in anything the young couple is saying. They're just trying to see where the rat is. I thought it was extraordinarily funny, and yet I couldn't explain quite why I found it so funny. And I love the denouement, the way that we finally get Polly presenting the box of biscuits. There's the little rat there looking at the inspector. And Basil actually says, "Would you care for a rat? Because what else do you say there?" So, and the actor, damn, I forgot his name, he's so good, who just looks at the rat and absolutely doesn't believe it. He knows it's not there, although he can see it. And he plays that so well. And then right at the end, you see Basil being dragged out. I'm very, very fond of that episode, because again, there's quite a lot in it. And there's some very good lines early on. I love when Manuel, of course, thinks that it's a filigree Siberian hamster, and Basil persuades him it's a rat. He said, "Don't you have rat?" He said, "Don't you have rats?" He said, "Oh, did Franco have them all shot?" That's one of my favourite lines.